Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jack.
How are you, John?
Very good, mate. What were you thinking for today?
Well, I was thinking about things that we've covered and things that we haven't covered. And one thing that I don't think we've discussed a lot about is managing athletes in season. And particularly, this is something that I thought of for you personally, because you've just finished the athletic season, or the domestic season, I should say. But you and a group of your athletes are going to be heading overseas to do the European season. So here you are finishing in, late March?
March, April, yeah.
The domestic season. And here we are now, mid-May, and you're going to be heading away mid-June. That's a long season. And it can be a challenging thing to think about how you actually apply enough training stresses, I should say, to make sure that they're not detraining and potentially increasing their performance, but at the same time managing their actual training load so that they can perform when they need to. And so, I was interested to hear how you actually go about navigating that, because it seems that you can't just be go and competing all year round. There's a reason why you have in-season and off-season, and there's a reason why you focus on different things. But how you manage that if you're going to be competing from January to what's going to be like July, August for some of these guys, that's a pretty long season. And what you're actually doing to manage that, and actually like what principles or what particular philosophies do you follow?
It's interesting because it varies depending on the level of the athlete and what they are trying to aim for. Because, for instance, the meaning and the requirement of what they need to do during the domestic season can change. Now, I'm not in a position that some athletes and coaches are in where, say, for instance, their athlete is easily qualified and they don't need to think about any of the preparation required around performing at a really high level during the domestic season.
Sure.
You always have to perform at a high level, but if you're trying to, say, gather ranking points, or you're trying to qualify, then it's very different to being qualified.
Well, I'm about to say, I know you have an athlete who has had a good season and is currently overseas and performing and actually doing really well, but I guess there's been some very significant progressions over the season, so it's hard to plan for now 6 months ago, because the reality is you've got to get to
a certain
step
point
one first before you can get to step 2 or 3.
Yeah, so it probably has influence. It's funny because this conversation, in preparation for, I was thinking about how do you navigate it? And actually what it's meant is significant change in the way you kind of approach the periodization process. And I think it very much changed for me a few years back when I started to think about this of you have to be in pretty good shape most of the time. How do you stay close to that? And as you said, how do you have the ability to keep and top things up at the right time so that you're not, diminishing throughout, say, a season?
Yeah, and I think I imagine that's particularly challenging in track and field, because unless you're an exceptional athlete, most people don't have the ability to be able to perform at 85%. And
no, you don't get away with it. No, unfortunately.
I imagine, in say AFL and a team sport, if someone's playing at 85%, it's actually okay, because they might be actually, for them, that's still contributing a lot to the overall success of the team. They don't need them to be at 100% every game. But, the reality is if you run, 10-1, but you are running at 85%,
yeah, you're only running 11 seconds.
This is the thing. It's like the difference between first and last.
Yeah. So it comes very much down to your planning and how you actually approach the application of training. I think the biggest thing, and we've spoken about this before, someone like Anatoly Bondarchuk, his methodology and more of that complex methodology of periodization starts to become something that you can use a little bit more. Now, we've mentioned this multiple times, but you need to understand the position of that athlete in terms of their maturation to training stress and tolerance. If someone has not got a significant training history, you could not necessarily go down the path of using a much more complex methodology, right? Because they just don't have the depth of stress tolerance to deal with lots of different stresses at multiple times and then not lose some of their foundation because they haven't been exposed to it over a long period of time. And an example I would give is if you've never done any strength training, if you do, say, 3 months of training and then you stop training, your strength training level will diminish, right? It's not going to diminish completely, but it'll diminish over a period of, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks. If you've done 10 years of strength training and your level of strength, and force producing capabilities is very high, say we'll pull up, numbers, but you can squat, say, 2.5 times your body weight. Even if you do not train squats for 6 months, you probably can still squat 2 times your body weight.
Yeah.
Right? Off nothing, which you probably wouldn't recommend someone do that. It's probably a bit dangerous to not do that and go straight into a really heavy squat session, but they could still probably do it.
And what you're highlighting there is they've still got that capacity.
Yes.
Like there are consequences, like you said, you wouldn't go, great, well, we haven't done it in 6 months, go and squat 2 times your body weight. It's more of, that they can access that force producing capacity for their performance still.
Because their exposure to that type of stress, heavy resistance training, has been so prolonged and it's created so much adaptation that their system has matured to the point where that it can actually continue to produce, and it has the floor to that capacity.
Yes.
Is at a minimum level.
Yeah, and so this comes back to your point then of you actually need to think about the individual athlete, because someone with next to no training history, even if they're actually almost a international level athlete, you probably have to address that or approach how you manage them from the domestic to international season very differently. In fact, does that actually create some challenges, because having a long season for that person puts them at risk of either having a detriment to performance or injury because of...
Yeah, it does. And what you have to do, so like, I think that we can describe it this way. Right? So if for someone who is at a very high level of training history, so they've got, 5+ years of what you would say is high level training, with them, most of the parameters that are important for running, but it could be, say, for football or anything, are actually well developed. They've got, if it's football, for instance, or soccer or team sports, they've got a very strong foundation of aerobic running capacity.
Yep.
They've got the ability to, carry out skills at, multiple hundreds of repetitions per training session or per, game day competition. They're able to, absorb the knocks and all those kind of things. They've got that in their system, right? Yep. And that's why you often, funnily enough, you see this actually for people who are interested and do watch things like AFL. You see the young players. Often one of the things that happens is later in seasons, they start to diminish. And it's because they actually just don't have the tolerance of playing at that higher intensity for that many games. And we're seeing more and more of this load management happening where younger players are not playing the whole season. And you see it even in terms of their exposure to, say, preseason training. You always hear about, say, high performance managers talking about the people below the age of maybe 22 and above the age of 28 actually have also training loads, right? The ones who are older, it's because they don't actually need to be exposed to more stress. Yep. And the ones that are younger, it's because they actually can't tolerate that level of training stress.
Yep.
So with those people that do have an increase in their level of maturity, you can probably do a much more complex method of and what I mean by that is it's lots of different stimuli happening at the same time. For people in team sports, you've got match simulation, you've got gym training, you've got extra aerobic conditioning running, you've got other resistance type stuff that you're doing all within the same week, all at a high level of intensity. Yeah,
and I think that straight away puts in the context of thinking about different periodization strategies. Because you hear this argument of what particular method should you apply, or there's more evidence for block sequential modeling and all this stuff. And it's clearly there is value in lots of different approaches, and clearly a lot of coaches have shown very good outcomes with using different models, and probably the better ones understand when it's more appropriate to apply a particular approach of the young athlete, we've got a long time period here, let's focus the type of stresses we're doing, and obviously that idea of sequential model, it's not like you're not doing anything else, but you're doing predominantly focusing on one particular thing as opposed to right, this guy's got their foundation. We just need to maintain all these things to mitigate injury and make sure that they have the tool set to keep performing at a high level.
Exactly. And so for me, I'm kind of lucky that most of the athletes I have now have gone past that period of, just needing exposure to stress.
Yep.
So it actually has made my job a hell of a lot easier in how I approach it, because
you've got to be patient to begin with, I guess. Yeah.
At the start, and it's something that I made a lot of mistakes with, because I tried to apply some of this methodology to people who didn't have that foundation.
Yep.
And it actually just blows them up.
Yeah.
Right? They get injured straight away. And the reason is because they actually don't have the ability to tolerate that, say, higher intensity stress across multiple different, training capacities. So the approach really is relatively simple, and it comes down to, from what I'm doing at the moment, it's relatively simple in the sense of I see certain KPIs as being really important, right? And if you think of any major sprint, it really comes down to also the 3 phases of sprinting, but the major KPIs are going to be like your acceleration capability, your maximal velocity, which seems to be the most important, and your ability to maintain speed or speed maintenance. And as long as you're maintaining those things at a reasonably high level throughout your training weeks or training cycles, then they tend to be able to continue to perform at a high level. Now, there are obviously foundational features that support those factors, right, which we can get into. But if those parameters are relatively strong, then their ability to perform at a high level is maintained throughout.
The question I have for you then is, to maintain those particular KPIs, you've got to be working at pretty much close to your max intensity for certain periods. Can that be sustained over a long period of time? Like, can you maintain training at those high intensities for 6 months, or do you actually have to have breaks at some points to be able to allow their system to recover?
Yeah, I think more than anything, you probably need mental breaks than you need physical. I think the thing that changes, and this is where you've got to start getting enough information about that particular individual, about what is the reversibility of those KPIs for that person. For some people, if they don't do maximal speed, running or maximal velocity running every single week of the year, they're screwed. It's going to disappear, right? And they're usually actually people who are not that fast.
Okay, yep.
Right?
That makes sense.
It's like they need that stimulus to maintain that capability.
Yes, and they're probably more of that slower twitch profile who can tolerate.
You say in relative terms.
Yes, I'm not saying that they're predominantly type 1 fiber, but
they're probably more type 2A than they are type 2B or type 2X, whatever you want to call it.
Well, probably better to say a hybrid then, which they're the type of athletes who can tolerate more training load overall. So in terms of being able to do those intensities for longer, as opposed to your more elastic type of profile.
Yeah. And so those kind of people, with them, you're needing to expose them to that often. And if you don't, or you go through significant periods where they're not exposed to it, you see those things diminish quickly.
Yeah.
Then if you have the people who, for instance, they're at the other end of the scale, for instance, they might not need to go completely maximal in their velocity, any closer than 10, 14, some people even 21 days apart, right? If they do that, then that's enough for them to maintain it.
Yeah, okay.
It's the same with strength levels. Like everyone, I think it varies from person to person, but there's some people who they may not lift heavy for a month, go to the gym, basically lift a PB. And it's like, well, okay, that doesn't diminish very quickly for that individual, particularly given their training history. So that becomes the game of how much of each of these parameters do I need to maintain and top up? And we've spoken so many times about the concept of complex systems approach. And for those people who still kind of are not 100% sure what we're talking about, that is essentially if you look at any feature of someone's performance, it's going to be we talk about confluence, meaning it's a combination of the influence of these major factors.
Yeah.
And as I said, someone's sprint performance is going to be a reflection of their maximal velocity, probably being the biggest, factor, their ability to accelerate, and then their ability to maintain those two, particularly the maximal velocity feature.
Yep.
Right? Those are the three biggest things in your arsenal. If they can do those regularly and they can do them well and they can maintain them, then they're going to continue performing at or close to their best. And your job is to work out with each of those factors, how often do they need to touch those training elements to make sure that they're able to maintain those. And if they can, then the performance that comes out is usually reasonably close to the level of performance that you would expect to be close to their best. And if we use the example, say, of a team sport, those biggest factors are going to be things like skills, their skill execution. If you're a basketball player, it's like, how good is your, jump shot? How good is your ability to move around the court? Right, so that's your physical preparation, and potentially you've got your understanding of the game, so like the technical and tactical elements associated with that. If you're maintaining those things, like they're doing some strategic and tactical training, they're doing some skills practice, and they're doing enough conditioning work to maintain their output of high intensity basketball play, they're probably going to be able to maintain that at a really high level. So the big factor that you then start to consider is, okay, in season, what do you get from competition that is able to maintain those things? If you're playing a team sport, it's like, okay, how much conditioning do you actually get from time on the field? Because that maybe means you don't need to do as much conditioning in a training setting.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I think of too is that in season, it probably makes you think about what are really the most important things here. Because the reality is you can get caught up in thinking, I need to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I need to get them super strong. And it's like, depending on the sport, that may be the case. But then how much is that really reflective of their overall performance? Because I guess that's the issue too, is like, don't get caught up in the 1%ers here, because ultimately, particularly in season when you're competing and that itself is such a large stressor, that's really going to influence in what else you can actually do between games, which for some athletes actually may not be very much.
Yeah.
But then there's that issue then too of like, you are going to see some maladaptation associated with that. And I think that's probably, a question I wanted to ask you too, because I think with running, you talk about these main KPIs, but then I also think about, and we talked about this recently, we're thinking about certain types of metabolic conditioning that essentially serves as that foundation for you to be able to tolerate those high mechanical loads and also probably sprint repeatability. But how do you actually approach that? Because if you start doing too much volume in season, you're going to have issues with too much fatigue. You're going to have issues with them not being able to run at high speeds and therefore lose some of that max velocity. Like, how do you go about finding that balance?
That balance is always about trying to determine like what types of training sessions are going to maintain those factors and deciding whether they are things that, for instance, are going to diminish quickly. And if they are, and for some people they do, where you place them and how you use them as part of your training cycles.
So is part of that then also managing people's psychology, knowing that there are certain times where you have to apply a certain amount of stresses to, maintain or top them up with that certain quality, but knowing that, look, you're going to feel fatigued, you're going to not feel great for the next couple of weeks, but you're going to come out of that better for it.
Yeah, some of it's that, some of it's having those conversations, but it's also about like competition management.
Okay, sure.
If you play team sports, it's a bit hard because you play every week.
Yeah.
Right, but sometimes you get lucky in the sense of like there's a bye. And it's like, okay, well that's our opportunity to top up. Right, I always find it interesting because a lot of the AFL clubs, and I think the ones, I haven't worked in AFL, as a full-time kind of person, so I don't know exactly what the mentality always is, but you hear of like, oh, we gave them, the whole week off. And it's like, okay, maybe they need the mental break, I understand that, but actually from a physical point of view, that's a really important time to like get some training load back into these people. And one of the ways that like we're lucky in track is like you can pick when you compete. Right? Not always. Sometimes there's certain competitions you have to do that are important, like, the national championships or whatever it is. But you typically get to choose and you know well in advance when these things are, so you can kind of plan your training heavily around that.
Sure.
And what I tend to do, which is the way that I approach it, is like you have mini training blocks that top up these major KPIs throughout the season. You know that, okay, I'm not going to touch this feature maybe for 2 or 3 weeks while we're competing regularly, because I know that it will be maintained through some of those racing factors. So I'm not going to actually try and train these because, as you said, the fatigue management of doing those means that the performance in the competition goes down. But I know I've got to come back to it and I've got to top those features up. So that becomes the real challenge of how do you do those? And sometimes if it becomes an extended period, you've got to start getting clever with how do I train some of these features without actually placing the stresses on their body. And that's where, using, say, cross-training becomes really valuable. Do I want to get, if you're looking at someone, and no, it's not the same transfer, be like, I really need some sort of metabolic stress. I need them to experience, that lactate, accumulation and their ability to buffer that and utilize it and be able to deal with the, feeling of the hydrogen. Like, can I find something in their week that gets them to do that is not going to be pounding with the ground reaction forces?
Yeah.
For AFL players or, rugby players, it's the contacts that's probably the thing that destroys them.
Yeah, absolutely.
The tackling, the bumps, the hits, the wrestling. Those are the things that probably deplete their body the most. So what you can potentially do is get them to do, say, even if it's grappling, but there's no velocity to it. It's like they're grappling for 3-minute rounds or something, but you're not at any point, you might even be grappling a bag. It doesn't really matter. You're just trying to get them to deal with that metabolic stress without the actual impact of what that means.
Yes.
And so that becomes the game that you start to play of like, okay, I need to maintain this feature. How do I maintain it? And I know that a lot of people have talked about this concept of like microdosing. And the whole idea of microdosing is like, what's the minimum amount of stimulus that I can use to maintain a feature during periods where I don't think I necessarily can implement a lot of training stress?
And I actually quite like that approach of it completely reverses, I think, the common concept people have of like, how much can I flog myself? Whereas opposed to like, what's the minimum amount I need to do? Knowing that...
One of the coaches that I love listening to the most, and he's a really interesting character, a guy named Henk Kranhoff, who's a Dutch coach. And, he always talks about this concept of like, what's this, the minimum amount of training that I need to do to get better? Because that's how much you should do.
Yes.
Not the maximum possible.
Yeah.
And it's always that concept of like, you should, in a very much, we talk so much about hormesis and, a lot of that came from the mithridization process that people understood with taking like poison and seeing if they could inoculate themselves against the effects of poisons. And his idea is like, you should see training as poison.
Yeah.
How much can you take before you kill yourself?
And I think that provides context too to think about, well, what's the demands of the sport? Because sure, if you're doing ultra marathons, you obviously need to do a lot of volume. It's a bit different.
Well, it's an interesting question because I know that there are coaches, particularly in the track and field world, who are very experienced and older. And I think I'm slowly starting to get exposed to this. Is like, what's the minimum amount that this individual, but this individual can do to actually continue to progress at this level?
Yeah.
Right? And it starts to sometimes tell you like the things that you thought maybe were larger KPIs are not. It's like this person doesn't do most of these things, but they're getting better and they're performing at a high level. Like an example is I've never really had 400-meter runners who, and some of them have done really well and have improved a lot, run much more than 3 to maybe 4, but mostly 3 sessions a week. They're only running really 3 days a week.
And that's in contrast to what a lot of traditional 400
Some
programs
people will be
like.
doing 6 sessions a week.
Yeah, okay.
Right? And a lot of that's failure on my part to be able to see how I can navigate that. But it hasn't seemed to hold them back, and it makes me think of like, okay, I've been wrestling with this a little bit actually recently of like, do I need to increase that? Do they need more capability to run more? It doesn't seem to be holding them back, but will it in the future? Those are the questions that I'm asking myself constantly because, you start to question whether you're actually setting them up with a pattern that's going to be detrimental long term.
Particularly to their max speed, yeah.
Not so much to their max speed. In terms of like, for something like 400 meters, it's more about the volume of running that they can actually get done.
Oh, but is the consequence of that, though, because you're under a high amount of fatigue, that you're not going to be able to sprint at higher velocities, and over time you're going to see a reduction in, like, say, for instance, like their 100-meter performance, which is going to have consequences to their 400-meter because of their max speed.
Potentially, but like as I said, there are those interesting people who they actually, the more running load, the better for them.
Yeah, okay.
They need more days, they need more exposure, and my maybe interpretation of them not needing that is not actually accurate.
Well, I wonder, is a lot of that got to do with that phenomenal concept of allostasis? Like, does the central nervous system in a 400-meter race go like, well, I know I've got to run 400 meters and it's going to take me this amount of time. I know I can reach this speed, but if I go to that speed too soon, I'm just going to die, and therefore they don't perform well, as opposed to someone who's done a lot of volume. They're like, well, I know that I've ran a lot of miles. Well, it's not going to be miles. Then they actually, I actually wonder is that some of the psychological preparation associated with performance of knowing I've done the volume to do this comfortably, so I don't have to hold back.
Yes, but I think that weirdly, like with the 400 particularly, it's so much about like learning to run at a speed that is, so as close to your max velocity as possible, and being able to be really comfortable there.
Yeah, okay.
And that only comes with exposure. So it's sort of like speeds, that specificity of exposure. And then it's, we've spoken before about speed reserve. Like speed reserve is everything in a 400 meters or any pace race. The higher the speed that you're able to actually hit, the easier it is for you to run at a particular speed. So that becomes the game. So it's... As no one wants this answer, but it depends. So it really comes down to what that individual is doing. But essentially throughout the season, I really think your job is so much to do with working out what does this individual or what does this team actually need to maintain for their performance to continue to be at the level that you want or growing. And it's an interesting question, because one of the things that you always question yourself is throughout seasons you would like to see performance grow. Right? You don't want someone starting at the season performing better than what they are at the end of the season.
Which can happen.
It happens a lot, not only in track and field, but especially say even team sports. You have a team that like starts the season and they're flying and they're beating everyone and they're on top of the ladder, and then they get to 3/4 of the way through the season and they're dropping and they sort of limp their way, and they make the finals, but they've limped their way to get to the finals. And it's like that really interesting really interesting observation of like, did they peak too early in their season? And is that a psychological phenomena? Is that a physical factor, or did teams work out how to beat them? Like what was behind that? Yeah,
and look, I guess there's multiple answers to that, but like in your own experiences, like what are things that you've noticed that have led to that outcome with athletes that you've worked with?
Well, sometimes it's not recognizing the profile of that person. Like, for instance, if they're early on in their development, even if they've got a bit of training behind them, but they're still developing, them having a really long period of time where they accumulate a lot of like training stress and therefore like physical fitness in those different capacities means that they start the competition season at their highest level of physical capacity. And if you just race and race and race and you don't top those things back up, they do diminish. And so for certain people whose profile is that those things drop off quickly and you don't recognize that, then you're in trouble.
Well, actually, I imagine the other thing too for the less experienced athlete of actually dealing with the stresses of competition itself, because that in itself is a larger stressor than just the mechanical load of the event. Or of the sport.
Yeah, and I think that happens, across different codes as well. Like particularly if you're performing well, the type of competition and the level of competition goes up. So, as you said, it's not just the physical stress of it; it's the psycho-emotional stress.
Totally.
You make the finals, all of a sudden that's way more stressful than a home and away season game. Versus, or if you're now have qualified and you're running at the national championships, it's very different to running at a club meet.
Well, and the other thing too then is if you, for instance, have a really good domestic season, you're like, you should continue to the international, to the European season, or whatever. It's all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm only used to competing for 4 months of the year. Now you're asking me to do 6-7 months of the year. Like, you're almost doubling the competitive period. I mean, there's obviously there's usually a break in there, but still, you're actually increasing the overall competitive season. And that in itself, like, for a seasoned athlete who does that every year, it's not such an issue. For someone who makes that step for the first time, like, it's probably, I guess, one of the reasons why you probably see a lot of athletes who go do the European season. A lot of the time, they might not necessarily have the best first season.
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of it. I think what you need to do you need to manage and you need to navigate is, like, how much training do I need to do to prop them back up? And it probably means being smart with not trying to compete too much through that sort of second season, and being a little bit more judicious with how much you compete at that point. Because I feel like the people who get greedy and think like, oh, I'm going to compete all the time, that very much happens. They sort of run out of gas. But the trick, I think, is if you can get a good volume and a good foundation of, training behind them to build up those KPIs that we spoke about, then they should be able to maintain it through that period. And we're kind of lucky in the sense of, like, our season is not 100% continuous. In the sense, it's not like you go from
domestic straight to international.
You've got probably at least 2 months in between that really kicking off and picking up. So you've got a chance to go, like, let's go lay some foundation of training back in. Let's not skip this. Let's make sure we top this back up.
And so, and I'm assuming then that's the kind of method you're following at the moment as they finish their domestic season. Do you actually give them all a period off? Yeah,
at a minimum, people will probably have about 10 days off following like the national championships. Some are a bit shorter depending on what they're doing, but likely it's usually around 10 days off. And I'm pretty, like, I used to be a lot firmer with that of like, I need you back 3 days. But I think that, and as I mentioned before, it's like there's that mental aspect to it. So I think one of the things that you kind of look at is like, knowing that they're going to be competing, and some of them it's not 6 months. It's like some of them are competing 9 or 10 months of the year. So if they're going to be doing that, like, when can you give them that opportunity to, go away and spend time with friends and family and do those things where they're not thinking, oh, I've got a big training session tomorrow, or, today I can't really, eat. I can't be like overindulgent with food. I can't have a wine with dinner, like all those kind of things. So you have to kind of build those factors into it, and I think that's a big part of the process when it comes to giving them a little bit longer.
The thing I'm thinking of is for clinicians who listen to us are thinking of some of these macro frameworks that you need to think about that influence people's injury or susceptibility to injury. Because I think that's something that's often overlooked for clinicians who may not have much exposure or experience in working with athletes. Like, what are some of the things that you think are often missed that are relevant to people's susceptibility to developing injury? Like just trying to train at a high intensity all year round, or not having periods off?
I think it's about rest periods and actually just having really good recovery processes in place. It tends to be the case that, say, for instance, for major competitions, you're wanting to get to a certain body composition, right? So it's like you can't be energy depleted for long periods of time. That
sort of was going to lead to a question I was going to ask you about competition weight, because how long can you realistically sustain that before you start to see detriments to the system?
Really, I don't think you should be trying to hold like your final competition weight for more than maybe 3 or 4 weeks, right? Or close to. In between, like you've got to go through periods where you really do up your calories again, because you don't want to be in an energy deficient state for a particularly long period of time. It's going to increase your susceptibility to injury. And you want to be careful with how you get there. So, we're very lucky. We work closely with, sports dietitians and things. So they manage that from a professional standpoint. And, we educate our athletes a lot about, like, these are the safe ways to get close to your race weight. It's not about doing silly things or fads or, starving yourself, because that's just going to lead to a really dangerous outcome when it comes to performance and or injury development. So you have to periodize that as well. If you're in a heavy training period, you should be eating a surplus of calories. You're trying to build tissue. You're trying to maximize on your training adaptations. And at that point, hitting, say, a final race weight is not the determining factor for your improvement. Now, you can rush that and you can drop weight to try and, say, oh, okay, on the stopwatch it was better, but that's not real improvement. So what you've got to do is make sure you're maximizing on, as I said, those recovery factors. And by far the two biggest ones are people. Well, I think there's three actually. The three biggest ones I tend to see that I think that people underestimate the value of them, even though they're aware that they're the more important ones. Are obviously nutrition. Making sure you're getting actually adequate calories in is probably a minimum standard. And
actually associated with that, micronutrients, because they obviously are going to provide or maximize.
Well, generally, if you're eating a reasonably varied diet and you're eating enough food,
the
micronutrient content is enough. There are obviously some people who don't absorb things well
or have restrictive diets.
But as long as you're not being restrictive with, like I'm not eating this food group or I'm not eating this, whatever it is, you don't tend to have that much of an issue with, as long as you're eating enough and you're eating varied throughout your eating patterns. And the other big one that people do know about is sleep. And it's funny. I actually think that a lot of people now in general, and I think even a lot of athletes, underestimate how much sleep you can get to optimize what you do. Like, I'm not talking the standard like bullshit of like, 8 hours is, what you need. I genuinely think that some people need 10 to 12 hours of sleep a day to optimally perform. Right? But it's not acceptable at a societal level.
No, and I think this is a broader point, is sleep cycles change throughout the year. Like, I think of where I live, because I live a bit further out, it's much more quiet, it's actually colder, it's darker. In winter, like, I can easily sleep 10 hours and I'm not an athlete, and as opposed to summer where you kind of feel like you can get away with, say, 7 or 8. But again, there's not a lot of room in society to accommodate for like, I'm going to sleep an extra 2 hours
every day now.
In winter now, so I'll be in work a little bit later. And the same as obviously if you're an athlete, because you've still got to, most athletes are still working,
part-time jobs and all sorts of stuff,
or they're still got to get up and train. But the actual process of how that is not constant, it's very dynamic.
And you hear a lot of this of like the very top athletes, particularly in sprint events. I feel like I've heard this saying before, and this is not to be offensive, but you hear of like, sprint and high velocity, high speed power athletes tend to be a little bit more like cats, right? And you think of a cat, it sleeps all day, sort of lazy, and then it moves really quickly and does what it needs to do. Versus, more endurance athletes are kind of a bit more like dogs, where, they've got lots of energy and they're always on the move and they don't necessarily sleep that much, and they're kind of, high energy, on the go, move.
And look, I think associated with that is that badge of honor of like, I get up at 5 every morning and I do this and do that, and I've done 50,000 things throughout my day, because there's that, that association of being busy as being, more successful or whatever it may be. But I think this is also a big point to take from this too, is when you're dealing with athletes, you have to understand that their training cycle is that it's cyclical in nature, and that you can't have an expectation that you just go from high performance from January to December, or you go from high performance in one sport to another. I think that's the other big one too, particularly for younger athletes who may be actually quite good athletes and they actually excel in lots of different sports. Then the expectation is like, great, the rowing season's done, we want you to go straight into playing AFL or whatever it is. And there's, I think associated with that is like, well, what is their training load? Are they just doing competition and sport specific basically all year round, and that they are doing very little general development? Because obviously there's a time and a place to do both. And the reality is, if you just do simply one or the other all year round, you're actually going to see detriments in either their performance or their injury susceptibility.
Yeah, definitely. And so, like, finishing off that point, I think that it also associates the other big factor that I think in the past I've probably discounted, but I think it's much bigger than what I ever thought, and there is evidence that really supports this, is, the psycho-emotional stress. You're saying obviously people changing from sport to sport. I think that in itself, it's a pretty big and pretty fast adaptation process at times, especially for teenagers or whatever it is, to have to go to that high level in one to high level in another really quickly.
Yeah.
But that psychological and emotional stress, I think, has a really big bearing on injury development and even performance. And there's obviously the evidence that supports things like the work we've spoken about it many times before, but like Brian Mann's work looking at the effect of academic stress periods and the increase in injury rates, irrespective, but as a secondary kind of independent factor associated with training load. It's quite interesting to see how much effect that has. Having had a number of athletes go through periods of, say, university exam periods, or very high sort of assessment periods with assignments and things like that, you see very quickly their performance drops off, and you have to be really, really cautious of making sure that you don't push them from a training load perspective, because that's when injuries have happened. And I think there's a naivety to think that like we can compartmentalize those things simply. It would be nice if that was the case, but it just doesn't seem to be the case. So I think those are, we talk so much about managing that hormetic load and the hormetic profile. Those to me are the three biggest factors, and you're constantly trying to manage those: nutrition, sleep. And when you know that, for instance, something is going to be high, say some sort of emotional stress, that's when you really push the others. Like, don't try to limit, multiple factors at the same time. Don't think like, oh, I can sleep 6 hours a night. Oh, I'm going to restrict my diet because I'm trying to get to competition weight, and I'm going to, I'm going to try and do this all during an exam period for university. It's like, that's a recipe for complete and utter disaster.
Yeah, and I think this highlights that idea of the health injury spectrum, where if you're an elite athlete performing at a very high level and you're exposing yourself to very high stresses, whether that's related to actual training stresses or competitive stresses, that's when you start to potentially see more of that divergence away from health to, again, a non-optimal state. And that obviously ties in with things like, maintaining a certain competition weight for a long period of time, exposing yourself to a lot of stresses, whether they be physical or non-physical. It just simply cannot be sustained. You're going to go too far away from optimizing your physiology, which increases your susceptibility to injury, not to mention just a detriment in performance.
Yeah, and I think like that's one of the things that I've become a lot more conscious of with managing these long seasons, is making sure, as I said, like giving them a little bit longer after, say, the nationals to catch up on some of those things, to, go through a 10-day period where they're eating like an absolute pig and they're in a huge calorie surplus, right? Like as much as the food might not be that healthy from, as you said, like a micronutrient kind of point of view, that they're not trying to maintain their race weight at that point.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge with this, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it, of when you say to an athlete, all right, I want you to do nothing for 2 weeks, they actually might feel like a pile of shit for those 2 weeks, because all of a sudden you've taken away that ongoing stressor where your body can start to actually secrete all the cortisol that's built up. And you might be like, I feel really flat. And that can be quite difficult psychologically for an athlete, because it's like, I'm used to feeling good. You used to that stimulus to kind of keep you going and get you almost overactivating that sympathetic nervous system, but obviously associated with that as having higher energy levels. But the reality is, if you burn that candle for too long, you're going to see the consequences of it.
Yeah.
And that can be a challenge in itself of like, don't worry if you feel like crap. Like, that actually may be the case. Your body actually needs to, recover. Yeah, exactly. Like, find that homeostasis again.
Yeah. And I think that understanding that means that you can kind of be a bit better with educating of, like, as you said, this is how you potentially will feel.
Yes.
And that is
particularly
okay.
People are addicted to, the effect of exercise and things like that too, which, a lot of people are, including elite athletes.
Well, I think it's probably less likely I see it less in sprints.
Yeah, okay. Because they look forward to having a break.
They seem to be intermittent kind of athletes, whereas I think with endurance athletes, they're the ones where it's like no, you actually should have days where you don't run.
Yeah.
Like, no, I run every day.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, is it healthy that you can't have a day where you don't run?
Yeah.
Like, I think that that's an interesting question to ask an endurance athlete is like, are you comfortable with the day where you don't actually do any endurance exercise? Because if you're not, there's a problem. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with training 7 days a week either. That's not the point that I'm making. The point I'm making is if you're actually addicted to this concept that you have to train every day, there's potentially something that you need to manage there.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else?
Well, actually, one other thing that we've kind of touched on, but I wanted to explore how you approach it, is tapering itself. Because, like, do you follow any particular method of philosophy for leading up to competition? And again, how do you balance those sort of mesocycles, I guess, where you are potentially reducing training load to allow them to be more prepared, but then again, making sure that you mitigate the detraining of reducing those overall training loads? So
I sometimes wax and wane with this, so I apologize if someone's asked me this before and I answered it differently. I don't really think there's such thing as like a big taper. All right, that's not true. If the way in which you perform and prepare is based on putting someone into a significant fatigued state consistently, then potentially there is a big scope for a taper to make a big difference, whether that's 10, 14, 21 days plus. And like the evidence is very clear. It doesn't matter really what the sport is. Like the recommendations are pretty straightforward, which are, reduce the volume, maintain the intensity. You may change density a little bit, but really if you maintain the intensity and you drop the volume between 40 and 60% for probably at least 7 to 10 days, you're going to get an improvement in someone's capability to perform at a higher intensity. However, it's an interesting thing because it depends on what you use to actually drive performance. That to me works if volume is the trigger that you consistently use. However, if you don't use volume as the thing that you consistently use as a training stimulus, then it becomes a very different proposition for how you taper someone. Now, you still may do a little bit less volume because you're trying to you're trying to make sure that they have actually fully recovered from whatever stresses they've had, whether they're competition stresses or training stresses. But it's much more about making sure that they've actually aligned all of those features of that complex system in a way that means that the best, the best outcome is likely. And to me, often it's much more about making sure that all of those levels have been topped up again. So, and you've coordinated them in a way that the person from a tactical or a technical point of view is really, really clear, and they've developed that level of, we talk about like automaticity for their execution. So as an example, like I kind of see this like ongoing tapering process, or maybe not so much tapering, but like preparation process that I go through when I select competitions to see that like from this competition, you're going to learn this, and then this one, you're going to learn this, and this one, you're going to learn this, and this one. And by the time you get to here, all of those factors have kind of been ingrained into the way that you carry this out. So when you go to the major competition, you're really clear on what you need to do. It's not so much that you've tapered, it's just that you're really, really consistent and clear on your execution at that point. You mentioned the athlete that I had, she's back now, but she was running over in Japan in the 400, and like it's her first year running 400s, more seriously. And the hardest thing for her is being able to understand her pacing and get her race execution comfortable based on, knowing the speed that you can go at and not blow up and all those kind of things. And, she ran personal bests while she was away. And most of that actually had nothing to do with the physical side of it.
Yeah.
it had mostly to do with her really being able to get that tactical understanding of the race sorted, and have really strong confidence in like, okay, I know my race plan and I know it really, really, really well.
Well, actually, and that's an interesting example too, because this is probably, is this her first season where it's been extended past the domestic season?
We did do a little bit more last year because I was aware that she had potential to go on further. So we only did another, I think, 6 weeks last year. And it was very funny because she really didn't like it. She was like, Nationals is done, I'm finished. And when she ran, she didn't run very well in the competition. We sort of trained for another 6 weeks and did a competition. And I said to a few of them, like, you need to do this because we're preparing for next year where the season doesn't end when Nationals is over.
Yep. Yeah. Did you want to touch on anything else on this topic?
No, I think they're the key ones. I think the biggest things, just to reiterate for people, obviously if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us. But the biggest things to really reiterate are like, managing through season, I think very much comes down to the type of periodization approach that you've got.
Yeah.
If you are doing it where someone needs a lot of foundation and you're using a much more sequential approach, understand how long those parameters last for and whether you need to do top-ups through the season. If you're using much more of a complex approach, then it's mostly about making sure that those parameters are maintained at a high level. Like as some people would say, it's like if these are the main balls that you need to keep in the air, make sure you don't drop any of them at any point.
Yeah.
Because picking them up off the ground's a bit difficult once it's fallen.
Yeah, and look, I mean, to essentially emphasize that point, it really highlights here the importance of understanding that person's current training status and their previous training history, which I think sometimes, particularly like clinicians, might overlook about the significance that has on if they present with an injury, because sometimes we can get too fixated on like, we just need to work on this tissue capacity as a basic example, and that may very well be the case, but you actually forget to look at some of the bigger macro framework that they use through their training season or through like a yearly period to go like, hang on, are they actually getting the foundation that they need to allow high performance to happen and then going through that cycle? Or are they someone who is always competing or just going from one sport to another?
And I think it's about understanding that process and being patient with it. There's an athlete that actually we had him on, Massimo Quarry, on our podcast. He really struggled for a couple of years with injuries. And this year was actually the first year that he basically didn't have any injuries at all, which to him was very interesting because he's like, season's done, all right, and I'm just going to take a break now. That was a bit weird for him because he's a slighter frame.
Yeah.
Physically, he wasn't particularly mature when he started in our program. And it's literally taken him 3 or 4 years to physically be able to tolerate the intensities of competition.
Yeah.
We were very cautious with him and we took an approach where it's like, okay, you're doing more foundational stuff compared to other people. But still, like, the competition stress was very high for him. And it took him a while for his body to physically mature enough to be able to tolerate that. And now I think at the age of 22, that's kind of happened where he's like, I can actually race pretty often and I can tolerate this and I'm not going to break down. And I think that's something that I heard a Jamaican coach talk about this with an athlete where he said, like, this athlete kept getting injured. And he literally said, he's like, there's nothing wrong with what we're doing. It's just he physically isn't mature enough to go as fast as his body's capable of going at the moment.
Yep.
Right. And it's going to take him 3 or 4 years for his body to actually almost like harden and get used to that physical stress.
The hardware can't tolerate what the software is capable of producing. Yeah.
And so I think you've just got to, and like sometimes, as you said, the reason I thought of that is what you're saying about clinicians. Like, we've got to update this, their hamstring strength or their calf strength. It's like, no, they actually just need to be able to tolerate another 2 or 3 20-week football seasons. Like, they're not ready to actually tolerate a 20-week season.
Yes.
And they're going to want to do it. So you're not going to be like, we're only doing 10 weeks.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Well, it's that issue again of the proximate versus ultimate causative factors because, associated with any injury, you're probably going to find a lot of potential things. And that's also reflective of what you actually measure and what you actually ask. But the reality is you might be missing some of the bigger levers associated with that person's injury, and particularly if they're re-injuring, to be like, well, we're working on their strength. Why isn't it getting better? I think the other hard one though too, and particularly for clinicians who might not be working directly with the sporting team, of the conversations you actually have to have then too with some of the personnel that client athlete has with the coach and things like that, because there may be some training errors based on what they're doing may not be appropriate for where they are with their development, or again, are they actually getting an opportunity to develop foundations in their physical capacities to then allow them to perform at a higher level. Unless you sort of asking those questions to actually get an overall idea of their periodization, what they're doing, you're going to miss out on probably bigger levers or the main drivers to their injury.
Yeah, definitely. Alrighty, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We always appreciate any feedback you can give us.